So we saw in that last example that sometimes the trig functions end up as negative values. And that's absolutely possible when we're dealing with angles that are greater than 90 degrees. So I want us to think about how the quadrant affects the sign of these different trig functions. Well, the sign of the sine function is going to depend on your y value. So if y is positive, then sine will be positive. If y is negative, then sine will be negative. Cosine depends on the x value. So if x is positive, cosine's positive. If x is negative, cosine's negative. And tangent actually depends on both of them. So if they both are positive, then tangent will be positive. If they're both negative, it will be positive. But if one's positive and one's negative, then tangent will be negative. So it depends on both x and y. If they have the same sign, whether they're both positive or both negative, it will be positive. If they have opposite signs, then you're going to have a negative. So let's think about our coordinate plane real quick. Here you have positive x and positive y when you're in that first quadrant. But when you go into the second quadrant, think about which coordinate became negative. It's that x coordinate that became negative. In the third quadrant, both values are negative. Both x and y would be negative values. But in the fourth quadrant, x is positive again, but y is negative. So we can use that coordinate plane to help us realize what the SIGN signs are for the different trig functions. So in the first quadrant, everything is positive. Because x is positive, y is positive, everything's fine. Now in the second quadrant, since x went negative, sine will stay positive, but cosine and tangent will be negative. In quadrant 3, sine and cosine are both negative because x and y are both negative, but that means tangent will be positive. Remember, tangent, if they have the same sign, then you'll have a positive value. And then in the fourth quadrant, since y is negative there, sine is negative, cosine is positive, and tangent will be negative since the sine and cosine values, one's positive, one's negative. So that's just going to be helpful as we are looking at solving some different kinds of problems with these trig values. So let's just decide the sign of these positive or of these different trig values. Now, we only looked at sine, cosine, and tangent, but sine and cosecant are the same. Cosine and secant are going to be the same sign, and tangent and cotangent are going to be the same. So really all we need to do here is to determine where in the coordinate plane these angles will be. So remember, quadrant 1 is angles from 0 to 90. I guess technically if they're equal to their quadrant angles. So between 0 and 90. Quadrant 2 are angles between 90 and 180. Let's put some degree signs. Quadrant 3 is going to be between 180 degrees and 270 degrees. And quadrant 4 will be from 270 to 360. Now, what if you have values that are beyond 360 or below 0? Remember, we can always add and subtract 360 to find that coterminal angle. So we'll have to do that a few times here. But the first one, sine of 20, that is between 0 and 90, first quadrant, so you're looking at a positive value. Now, sine of negative 200, where is that going to be? Well, we need to find the coterminal angle between 0 and 360. So take that negative 200 and add 360, and you see that this is the same thing as 160 degrees. So that puts this angle in quadrant 2, meaning sine will still be positive. Sine of 200, though, is in quadrant 3 because it's between 180 and 270. So we're looking at a negative and sine of 340 is between 270 and 360, quadrant 4. Now let's look at some values for cosine. 20 is in the first quadrant, so cosine will be positive. Negative 30, we don't really know where that is, so we need to get that into a value between 0 and 360. So if we add 360, we see that that is coterminal with the angle 330. That's in the fourth quadrant. Cosine is positive there. Cosine 160 is in the second quadrant where cosine is negative. 200 degrees is in the third quadrant where cosine is negative. Let's do tangent. Tangent of 20 degrees, we're in the first quadrant, so tangent is positive. Cosecant, remember we're going to compare that to sine. 355 degrees is in the fourth quadrant, so sine is negative there. Cosecant will also be negative. Tangent 200, we are in quadrant 3, which means tangent is positive in quadrant 3. 160 is in quadrant 2, so tangent is negative there. Tangent of negative 20, well, let's add 360 here, since that's not in our specified values. That's the same thing as 340 degrees. That's quadrant 4, so tangent is negative. 50 degrees is quadrant 1, so we're looking at positive. 310 is quadrant 4, and so cotangent there is based on tangent, and tangent's negative in quadrant 4. So I want you to pause the video here, and you've got 5 more, and you'll have to think possibly about what the reciprocal function is, determine the quadrant, and determine if you're looking at a positive or a negative angle. The answers that you should have gotten for these values: negative 6 degrees is coterminal with 354, and negative 135 degrees is coterminal with 225. And then you were able to relate cosecant with sine, cotangent with tangent, and secant with cosine.